You're listening to the Cultivating Careers in Alternative Proteins podcast, a podcast which features students and early career professionals who work in the alternative protein industry, where they discuss their journeys and deliver advice on how you can start a career in this revolutionary field. I'm always eager to speak with people who have a unique career in the alternative protein industry. One such person, and this episode's guest, is Mathilde Do Chi, a vegan food consultant who started her own consultancy agency called Vegan Food Law. She has gained expertise in Europe, Asia, and North America food law and regulatory affairs in both the private and public sectors, through working with the FAO of the United Nations, Japanese government, French government, NGOs, global consultancy firms, multinationals, and law firms. Mathilde has a diploma in food psychology, a master's of laws in international trade and investment law, and a Master's of Laws in Food Law. On top of all of that, she is the VP of Regulatory Affairs for both the Vegan Society of Canada and the Vegan World Alliance, as well as the Chief Compliance Officer for BeVeg. Without further ado, here is my discussion with Mathilde. Welcome, Mathilde, to the Cultivating Careers in Alternative Proteins podcast. I am very excited to have you on the show today, and I'm very much looking forward to speaking with you and hearing about your experiences.
Thanks for having me. That's really my pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to discussing about what I do.
So to start off, maybe you could tell us how you ended up working in the alternative protein space.
So it started about 4 years ago. I was just finishing my first master's in international trade and investment law. And to write my master thesis, I went to Southeast Asia, where my thesis was on traditional food. And I did a lot of research, and I found out through trade, I could actually pursue a master's in food law. So I did that in Rome, in Italy. And at the same time, I was also working at FAO of the UN, the Food and Agriculture Organization, in the nutrition division as a food system intern. And then I realized that there was some kind of discrepancy between the way most of the actors I will have to collaborate on a daily basis view what a sustainable food system is. And this is also when I learned about the alternative protein space. So that time I was a pescatarian. Shortly after I became vegan, and I really wanted to contribute to a food system that is fairer, more sustainable, healthier for us, and also kinder to the animals. And afterwards, I ended up in the food supplements industry, where I was doing the compliance check for products coming from North America to Europe and also from Asia. And then I worked as a regulatory specialist in a multinational that is specialized in food ingredients, ADM, in Germany. And I was mainly working in the plant-based sector, and I really wanted to learn more about alternative proteins. So everything fermentation derived, or cultivated meat, or fish, and so on. So I decided to become a consultant, and I'm now specializing in global alternative protein regulation.
All right. So what really inspired you to make that transition and start your own consultancy?
So I really wanted to make an impact. I know it sounds really cliche, but this is how I felt at the time. And I still feel like when you are in full control of what you are working on, you can better design your approach to what you want to contribute to. And I realized plant-based, it's a nice industry, but when I started diving in it, most of the time you will only rely on a couple of ingredients because you had a lot of investment that had been used to better these ingredients, such as soy, pea, and also wheat, because they are really functional ingredients. And then I learned more about what you can do with algae or microorganisms or even fungi, and also cultivated meat. I do acknowledge that the way I eat, my diet is very particular. And if we want to help people transition, we have also to develop alternatives that are more appealing to consumers, such as cultivated meat. And I really wanted to have a global outlook because I come from a multicultural family. I'm half French, a quarter Dutch, and quarter Vietnamese. And growing up in that type of environment, I always knew that the way people see food highly depends where you live, what kind of culture you have grew up in.
It's important to acknowledge that even though food is a global phenomenon, it's actually regulated at a local level.
And seeing the different approaches around the world, for me, it's really, really interesting. And I'm also passionate about traveling. I've been to almost 40 countries, and every time I go to a new place, I always like to spend some time in supermarket or a restaurant to see what is actually traditional and ask people a lot of questions about how do you think it's really related? Why is the base of your diet and so on. So I feel it's really about discovering and stepping out of your comfort zone.
Yeah, definitely. And when you're able to travel and explore very different countries and cultures, you'll notice there's lots of different ways that cultivated and plant-based meat products are perceived in different areas and how it affects their diet and how they're socially accepted. And obviously, from your perspective, definitely the regulatory framework is drastically different between different countries and regions. So I'm curious to know your thoughts on how regulatory affairs differ between the various regions and countries that you've been to.
I would say that you have to look at whether the market you intend to commercialize in is actually part of a wider scope. Like, for instance, if you are aiming to sell in France a plant-based alternative, then that's really nice about the EU. You have supposedly a harmonized system. So meaning that as long as a food is legally authorized in one member state, then you just have to change a bit the language requirements because there are about 24 official languages in the region. It's easier to do trade as well because once you are compliant with one country, you're good to go for the others. And it also depends when the food regulatory system was established. You have, for instance, the Asian region is really interesting, but then working there, I realized that you have some specificities that are actually not regulated. And these depend on the food that is imported and what kind of regulations the country of origin has. You will see that sometimes you will have mutual recognition agreements, or it's sometimes written in free trade agreements. If they don't have a specific rule on this, and you can prove that your product is safe, then you are good to go. And you see this type of harmonization phenomenon happening in different regions, for instance, LATAM or ASEAN, but it's very fragmented. And I'm not really sure if at some point they're going to manage to have a uniform market.
I'm really looking forward to seeing how countries will manage to design a system that is well suited for their needs.
Yeah, I'm curious to see how it's going to get developed by the regions over different years. And one thing that I want to touch on is the nomenclature. And I recall reading recently that the Asia Pacific cellular agriculture industry recently announced a signing of a memorandum of understanding that food products grown directly from animal cells will officially be termed cultivated. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how you feel this will affect the regulatory approval of these products, as well as how this term will be translated to other languages.
Thanks a lot for your question. It's very interesting. I think for cultivated meat, fish, egg, and so on, the adjective cultivated is way better than lab grown or cellular, because you also have to think about once your product is regulatory approved, then I feel like your next barrier is going to be consumer approval, that you have to make them understand that there is another way of eating, that it's safe, require little tweaks for them. It's really a short step that they have to take. And if you give some sort of weird names to a product, then I think from a marketing point of view, it's really difficult to get approval from the consumer because they're just going to feel that your food is quote unquote fake or is not as nutritious as their animal-based counterpart.
And I'm also really looking forward to seeing how is it going to be regulated at the global level, because you don't have any codex guideline or codex standards at the moment. The international interest is growing with the involvement of some UN agencies. Last year, GFI APAC organized a workshop with the Western Pacific office of the World Health Organization, WHO, where they concluded that very few countries in the region had a dedicated framework to govern that type of foods. And this year, back in September, the FAO organized in Israel a meeting where they gathered a group of researchers and developers to discuss cell-based foods and to exchange different point of views and see how such foods they could be regulated in several parts of the world. Overall, they concluded that countries would generally benefit from a harmonized system, and guidance from the UN would be really appreciated. And in turn, it would also allow companies to navigate the global regulatory framework with ease and identify the key markets for their product, ultimately creating a system that can foster innovation and making sure that this type of foods are safe for consumers.
Yeah, and I'm curious to know your thoughts on which country you think is going to be the next one to regulate and approve of cultivated meat. In December 2020, Singapore became the first country in the world to approve of the sale of cultivated meat, and no country has approved cultivated meat since then. So I'm curious to know what you think will be the next country.
I feel the US is going to be the next market to approve a cultivated meat product, considering that when companies, they are looking at their potential first market, they will usually go either to Singapore or the US, considering, for instance, that the strictest food system in the world is the EU. And I have not seen any companies based there being able to go so far as filling in a novel food dossier.
But the thing with the US, the system is often mistaken as an approval system. The GRAS is a notification system, meaning that when you want to sell that kind of product, you will conduct your own analysis, and then the FDA will render some comments on your application. And if you are good to go, then you receive as a company a no questions letter, meaning that provided the information that you were able to give to the authority, your product is deemed safe.
Whereas in the EU, you simply cannot bypass the decision of the European Commission if they deem that the food is not safe, even though you may have good legal insurance to prevent some risk of litigation for people that would have developed an allergic reaction. So I feel that definitely the US is the market poised to be the next one, allowing the next product possibly in a near future.
Just to clarify there, you mentioned the GRAS certification. For people who aren't familiar with that, that's generally recognized as safe.
Correct.
On your point about Europe, I've read that there's some concern that cultivated meat may go down the same path that genetically modified organisms and foods have faced in Europe where they're banned. So I'm wondering what the European Union, how they will address cultivated meat. Will it go down a similar path to GMOs, or will it try to be more open?
I would say that the best solution for me would be to have a dedicated system for that type of products, because they are sometimes between novel food requirements and also maybe GMO.
GMOs are actually allowed, but the regulatory path in comparison to the US or Canada is way more tedious and time consuming.
And the time that you have to spend to elaborate the dossier when you apply, and also how much time the authorities they need to evaluate your product is between 3 to 5 years. But it can be even longer than that, because you get a lot of clock stops when the authorities, they say, we don't feel that you are providing enough information to demonstrate that your product is safe. And then in that type of situation, they give you a break of 6 months for you to gather the data. And then when you come back, they start the analysis again with the new information that you provided. But at the same time, at the European level, they acknowledge that we have to change our food system. It's written in the Farm to Fork report that was released 2 years ago. And also the EU committed to reach net zero by 2050. And you cannot do it if you are not willing to change the food system. So I feel like we need some pressure from lobbies to advocate for a new system. And at the same time, the system that we have right now, it's one of the strictest in the world. It is not necessarily the most innovative. It can be updated. So yeah, I'm curious to see at authorities, they will think about having a dedicated framework to make sure that we are bringing novelty to the market and also building a better food system.
Yeah, and especially since there are a lot of cultivated meat companies in Europe, I think there's definitely some motivation from them to get some sort of framework set up for these products.
Yeah, totally. And I feel as well, you have some countries that are willing to have something established in the near future. But the way it works, like for instance, the Netherlands, I actually was fortunate enough to study in Maastricht University, where the very first prototype of cultivated meat was unveiled. It was in 2013. And at that time, I didn't really grasp why it was important to have that kind of thing. The emphasis at that time by media, they were mostly put on the price. But the way it works in the European Union, it's a harmonized system. So even though the Netherlands would like to have cultivated meat put on the market in the near future, that's something that they cannot do because the final decision is given by the European Commission.
And most of the cultivated meat companies in Europe are located in the Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, and also France. France has a startup named Gourmet that is focusing on foie gras, duck liver.
Right, yeah. And going back to the Netherlands, I read somewhere that the government approved the use of cultivated meat for consumer testing, I think it was.
Yes, it was in the Netherlands, but it's the part before filling in for approval. So you can do testing in a private setting, but you have to make sure that you are legally covered because you never know what type of allergic reaction someone may develop after eating the product.
And it's not that once allowing the testing of that type of product that you can go around in supermarkets as a brand and say, hey, we are working on this. Would you like to try? It's not something that is happening right now, but it's a good step in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just a little bit closer to approval and sale of these products. I want to dive a little bit deeper into what specifically you do on a daily basis in food regulation, food law, and regulatory affairs.
Usually with my clients, we will have a first conversation about what they want to achieve, what kind of product they have managed to develop, and then to see whether or not it can be classified as novel food or GMO and so on, and to understand their overall approach. If they are not willing to go to the European market, maybe they can try another. But I have to explain to them what kind of opportunities and challenging they may encounter. Like if you want to sell a product that is going to be approved faster in another part of the world than Europe, for instance, Singapore, you also have to be aware that the market there, Singapore is only 6 million inhabitants.
While the EU is about 450 million inhabitants.
And once your product is approved there, it doesn't guarantee you that neighboring countries in Asia, they will also approve your product. And it's a lot of discussion about knowing where the client is coming from. Most of my clients, they are actually from science background. So they don't really comprehend how the regulatory system works sometimes. And sometimes they also have been not really well advised by someone else, telling them, oh, your product is going to be on the market tomorrow. It's not novel food. But then they mistook the way their product was regulated. Like, for instance, you have generic terms like mycelium. And in Europe, you only have one variety that is authorized. And just because their product is also mycelium based, they assume their product doesn't need to go through novel food. And for me, it's just about teaching people how the system works and how they can navigate it better on their own later on. But it's a lot of explaining and discussion at first.
I see. Okay. So you're essentially trying to help scientists and alternative protein companies understand the framework and laws and regulations that they need to adhere to in order to get their products approved.
Yeah. And I also would like to add that sometimes there is kind of misunderstanding about the meaning of the words, legally speaking. I think the prime example of it is everything related to plant-based food. It's common practice to name a product that is an alternative to cow milk made from soy milk. But legally speaking, you cannot call it like this because it's not from an animal, so it's soy drink. So it's the very same, and actually it's not peculiar to the food sector. You have the very same thing, for instance, in crypto, where the time being you don't have like a harmonized system. And countries, they will classify them as into different categories, like different type of assets, whether it's digital or physical. What I always say to my clients is rethink the meaning of the word, because there are high chances that doesn't mean what you think it means in a legal context.
I didn't know that about crypto. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's a mess right now, but I feel like it's on the same path as alternative proteins, that the system will change, but you see two countries that are willing to welcome that type of innovation and some countries that are not really keen on having this type of alternative. but ultimately the only constant is change. So you have to embrace the century we are living in, and also to admit that you cannot keep the status quo for a long time.
Yeah, both of these industries are in their very nascent stage.
I agree.
So I feel you work with a lot of scientists for different companies, but there's also a very important aspect of understanding the science behind how the products are made. I would presume that would have impact on the regulatory approval. So I'm wondering how you feel that your educational background has helped you in your career.
I actually taught myself everything related to the sciencey part because that's not something that is really addressed in legal curriculum. I feel most of the time the science part is tackled by the food safety module. So microbiological parameters or everything related to food quality. That's something that I picked up working in the multinational I mentioned earlier, because I was working close collaboration with different departments. And the way you have to approach a certain topic sometimes depends on what type of information you are aware of and what is your expertise in this. And funny enough, most of the people working in regulatory affairs, they are not from a legal background. They are actually from a science background. But it can also be a drawback because the way you may interpret legal text, the legal meaning doesn't really correspond to the scientific one. And they can think that one product is allowed, and in the end, it's not the case. And there is a lot of beauty in having a team with different backgrounds because you get a better understanding about the whole topic.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive that you were able to teach yourself about the scientific understanding of alternative proteins. How did you go about doing that?
So actually, before choosing law, I wanted to be a vet. So in France, you have to specialize in high school, whether you take the scientific path, economic path, or for instance, like more language based. And I followed the scientific path. So I really had some basics. And in my family, I have a lot of people working in science, also in the food industry, in food development department. So every time I have a question, I always have someone to rely on. And I feel like if you are not willing to comprehend how the whole food system works, you shouldn't be working in this industry. You have to be curious to know how the system works, but also know your limits. If it's something so technical, I know that I will need to rely on someone else. And usually, since I work with a lot of scientists, they will explain to me some bits that I couldn't wrap my head around. And then they mainly need me for the legal part. So I think it's complementary. But the science part is also something you can pick up if you like cooking, for instance, especially baking, because baking is really a science. If you want to bake something very technical like a souffle, I don't know if you have heard about that type of cake, but it's very delicate to cook. If you don't follow the exact recipe to the gram, then you're going to fail. So that's also where I got the understanding that science is not there just to make the topic prettier. That's something that you have to master at least the basics.
Yeah, I can see that being definitely a very collaborative effort in terms of understanding the science and regulatory approval. And I agree 100% about your comment about cooking and baking. My pandemic hobby was getting into cooking and baking. I learned a lot about the science and understanding behind products and how they interact and bind. And it was definitely a very informative experience, very hands-on and easy for anyone to do.
Totally. And since I also have a very peculiar diet, so I'm a vegan, but I'm also gluten intolerant. So the nice thing about gluten when you bake is the elasticity that you can get from the flour. Something I have to learn about what kind of substitutes that you can use to, for instance, mimic egg.
I generally use a flax egg. I find that fairly similar in terms of the binding capabilities.
Yeah, I agree, especially for pancakes and other sweet stuff.
I'm really looking forward to seeing that kind of products in the supermarkets. And also, what can you do with it? How much do you need to replace the original egg? And if you need to do some tweaking for a particular recipe.
Yeah, I'm curious to see how you would use it for baking applications. I've heard it's generally more used for omelets and scrambled eggs, but I don't know how well it would work in baking applications.
Yeah, I will circle back when I have the opportunity to try.
All right. And speaking of the future, where do you see yourself as well as the regulatory approval of alternative proteins in the next, say, 5 to 10 years?
So in 5 to 10 years, I would still see myself working in the food industry, maybe at a different role, working again for a company. Why not? And in terms of how the landscape may be shaped at that time, I feel if we don't have cultivated meat in certain part of the world yet approved in, let's say, 10 years, that at least we will have a better system regarding fermentation derived, especially for genetically modified microorganisms, because most of the time it's not regulated as an ingredient, even though it is.
Instead of telling them that it's something so difficult to have approved that they have to figure out the whole system on their own, and instead to have a dedicated framework to empower them, encourage innovation, and build a more future-focused food system. And ultimately, enable them to reach new markets.
You don't really have a lot of guidance when you have to remove the modified DNA from your final product. That's something that is kept kind of secret because a lot of technologies are patented. But I feel it would be nice to see certain type of collaboration emerge from trade association, giving guidance to companies, telling them that they could use this and it's accepted by authorities. And I would add that in terms of consumer approval, that 5 to 10 years, people are more aware that the way we eat 3 times a day, really it's something that is affecting our environment as a whole. And we have the responsibility as consumers to better our food habits.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And it's a really fascinating field and industry. And I'm wondering if you have any advice for job seekers who would want to get into the alternative protein industry.
I would say that if you want to work in that type of industry, you have to be somehow a maverick because you are working towards something that has never been done. And it's also difficult to navigate because at the time being, I don't think you have any university in the world right now having alternative protein degree. You definitely have some courses around the world, but you have to learn about the topic yourself, but you also have students association that can provide you some help about what type of career you may have in that type of industry. I have had some students reaching out to me, especially one that is studying law because she was just curious about how can you work in a scientific industry without having a science degree. And don't be afraid also to reach out to people on LinkedIn because people are most of the time really willing to share what they have done to do that type of job. And sometimes you see it's mostly about network. So I would recommend to students willing to work in this industry just to be curious and to see what is out there.
Excellent advice. Definitely something is of interest to you. Don't be afraid to pursue it, even if it's maybe not a common path. And yeah, be very exploratory and curious.
I totally agree. When I was studying food law, most of my classmates, they were drawn towards the animal-based sector because at that time, almost 4 years ago, it had this kind of reputation that only you can have a sound and safe career if you are working for animal-based company because of cultural aspect or the money that you can bring in because a lot of the time animal-based products they are actually subsidized. But just the growth experienced by the plant-based sector in the last year, I think it's amazing how far we have come as an industry. And it's not because it's not trending at the moment or people that are just telling you that it's never going to happen that you shouldn't make up your mind for yourself. I feel like our food system at the global level is going to change so much in the upcoming year. And I'm just looking forward to it.
Yeah, same here. And it's going to have to change because the path that we're currently on is not sustainable at all.
I totally agree.
All right. That was all the questions I had for you. Is there anything else that you want to talk about or discuss that we didn't touch on yet?
Talking about plant-based foods, I wanted to say that I've actually been working extensively on that topic for the last 6 months. That I just released a report that is available on my website about how to navigate the regulatory landscape on your own as a company in Europe. So it's the EU, Switzerland, and UK, because the two other countries, they have similar rules in place. And it has been specifically written for non-lawyers, especially marketing people, because I feel that sometimes you are so eager to promote your product that you may not know how the system is working or just ignore what type of risk may have for your company. So I just wanted to provide a clear scope and clear roadmap to people and also make easier for them to commercialize their products without facing litigation.
Yeah, that sounds like a really intriguing report. You said it's on your website?
Yes, so my website is veganfoodlaw.com, and I have a page dedicated to the guidebook.
Excellent, and I'll provide a link to that in the show notes. Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, Mathilde, and I'm very delighted that you were able to take the time to speak with me. Thank you for coming on the show.
Likewise, it was my pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for providing this type of platform and showcasing what people are doing in the alternative protein sector.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you for listening. Mathilde's journey illustrates that truly immersing yourself in a certain niche of an industry can make you a highly valuable asset to the industry. This is further evidence of how there's a place for everyone, including you, to be a part of the alternative protein revolution. If you want to learn more about careers in the alternative protein industry, please follow the Cultivating Careers in Alternative Protein podcast on Instagram for weekly posts about episode releases, alternative protein resources, job boards, career advice, and so much more.